Okay, so good afternoon. My name is Evan Wheeler, and we're going to Canada today. We're going to go through Canada from coast to coast, border to border. Most of the border is the United States or the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean, and Newfoundland. And Canada was born 157 years ago yesterday. Yesterday was Canada Day. It used to be Dominion Day, but it's Canada Day now. And this is when I was in Vancouver in 2017 when friends took us around for Canada Day. But Canada doesn't start in Vancouver. In fact, Canada starts in this place, Port Charlottetown. And that is in Prince Edward Island, and that is where Canada was formed back in 1864, 1865, 1866, and finally 1867. Now, young American elementary school students are introduced to Canada by a poem. The poem is called Evangeline. How many of you read Evangeline back in the day? I'm sure you did. Anyway, it was a poem by the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He wasn't supposed to write it. There was a Catholic priest in town that started this poem and said, hey, listen, Henry, I don't feel like doing it. You want to do it? And he did. He went down to Philadelphia and he did the research on Evangeline. The poem follows an Acadian girl named Evangeline in her search for her long-lost Gabriel, set during the time of the expulsion of French or Acadians from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. It wasn't it was New Brunswick at that time. No, it wasn't. And Prince Edward Island and part of Maine. And that's Evangeline, the story about her. The expulsion, the forced removal by the British of Acadian people from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and also part of Maine back in those days before the United States became the United States and Canada became Canada. In fact, it was Massachusetts, and there was no New Brunswick, it was Nova Scotia. Some of the Acadians ended up in Louisiana, and they formed Cajun culture. The expulsion took place over 6 years, 1755 to 1764, occurred during the French and Indian War. There were 14,100 Acadians living in that area. Eventually, 11,500 of them were deported. Many of them died either from drowning at sea or being prisoners at a terrible prison camp. That's Louisbourg. That was the largest fort in North America when it was built in 1730 by the French, and it would eventually be sacked by the British. During the 7 Years' War, that was the war that George Washington started. Did you know that? George Washington started that war in 1754, a British citizen. The Crown told George, listen, we want you to go somewhere in what is now Pennsylvania, go talk to the French, see if you could smooth things out. He did. He killed Jumonville, who was the head of the French delegation. He was captured, prisoner of war, sent back to Virginia, but he started the French and Indian War. Montcalm, the Marquis de Montcalm, was killed in 1759 in Quebec City, and there's a reason you speak French, because this Battle of Quebec City, back in 1759, the English against the French, the English won, and the French lost Quebec City, or control of Quebec City, to the English. City defeated, or it was defended by the French general Marquis de Montcalm, and it was on Abraham's Farm, which is now known as the Plains of Abraham. 15 minutes, the British came up a cliff. It's a stone city, stone walls around until a certain point, and there's a cliff. The French never thought that the English were going to come up the cliff and get onto the Plains of Abraham, or Abraham's Farm in those days. It was a 15-minute battle, and the British won. They killed Montcalm, and they surrendered Quebec. And that is the Plains of Abraham, Hotel Frontenac, or Chateau Frontenac back there, and this is the battlefield, a very historic battlefield in North America, where history really did change because the English took control of the French colony. That's looking down from the top of Quebec. So this is basically where, this is the other side. This is the side they climbed. And it's a steep cliff, but they climbed it. It was a foggy day, and they hit the battlefield, and that was the end of that. The roots of the American Revolution. Well, the British and French had coexisted in North America, but the threat of French expansion into the Ohio Valley caused the British to attempt to eradicate New France, ethnic cleansing, from the map completely. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham, or Abraham's Farm in those days, Quebec City, was permanently lost by the French. In 1763, France formally ceded its claims to Canada. Quebec's French-speaking Catholic population came under the rule of the Protestants, the British, and the Americans are looking at this and saying, or they weren't the Americans yet, they were the Southern colonists, and they're saying, we have an opportunity. The English have left, and let's see what goes on. And of course, the English started taxing the Southern colonists, and the Southern colonists would rebel. But the Northern colonists didn't rebel. They're watching closely in the South. They know England has won in Quebec, and they chased the French out of Nova Scotia. Basically, England pulls its best troops. There is a large shared history between Canada and the United States, a very large shared history, but in school you only learn the American half of the shared history. Taxation without representation, that is the Boston Harbor. That's off Atlantic Street up in Boston. And if you ever get the urge to throw tea into the water, you go here, and this is a restaurant, and they'll give you for $10 a tea bag, and you can dump it into the water. Or you can just take a tea bag as you go across the bridge and just fling it into the water, and you too can be like Samuel Adams, I suppose. The Quebec Act, that was passed in 1774 and allowed Lake Canadian, the Quebecois, to have religious and linguistic freedoms to openly practice Catholicism and use French. The Canadians were therefore not unhappy enough with British rule to choose to participate in the American Revolution. The Americans did try to get Quebec in 1775. Benedict Arnold led the attack, and Benedict Arnold forgot what the weather was really like in Quebec in December. Cold and snowing, and the Quebecois handled Benedict Arnold, and the Americans lost the battle and lost the chance to seize Quebec and Quebec City. American Revolution, 1775. See, you thought I was going to talk all about Canada, right? There's a really long shared history. American Revolution, 1775 through 1783, arose from growing tensions between the residents of Great Britain's 13 North American southern colonies and the colonial government, which represented the British Crown. Skirmishes between British troops and colonial militiamen in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, April 1775, kicked off an armed conflict. Following summer, the rebels were waging a full-scale war for their independence in America. France entered the American Revolution on the side of the colonists in 1778, turning what had been a civil war between rich people in the United States, or the American colonies, and the Crown, into an international conflict. That's the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. A long time ago, I had hair and it wasn't gray. Nova Scotia was in a dither over whether the colony should join the southern colonists in defiance of Britain, and rebellions flared in Nova Scotia, which was a theater of the American Revolution, the Battle of Fort Cumberland in 1776, and the Siege of St. John in 1777. The old rocking chair in Sydney, Cape Breton. By the end of the Revolutionary War, Nova Scotia had outfitted a number of privateers to attack American shipping. British forces based in Halifax succeeded at preventing American support for the rebels in Nova Scotia. The British captured a lot of American privateers in battles such as the Battle off of Halifax in 1782. Many more attacks on shipping and settlements until the final months of the war. The war ends in 1783, but really it ends in 1781 when the Americans beat the English in Yorktown, Virginia. The war's just about done and then allowed the English to go back to fighting France on the European continent. Well, this sounds like Guy Lombardo here. How many of you remember Guy Lombardo and New Year's Eve in Auld Lang Syne? Remember that? From the Waldorf Astoria Ballroom. Well, I'm going to read you this. The Treaty of Paris, 1783. American and British negotiators signed a treaty. Hostilities end, recognizing America's independence. Now here's the Guy Lombardo, who was, by the way, Canadian. The war formally ended in a Paris hotel room on the morning of September 3rd, 1783, when both sides signed a treaty pledging to forget misunderstandings and differences. So like Auld Lang Syne, we'll just forget the fact we have all these people who were killed and all this other stuff. We'll become best friends. Well, the Americans and Brits did become best friends for about, I would say, 150 years, somewhere around there. The English controlled Nova Scotia. In 1784, the Loyalists fled after the American Revolution and were placed in what would become New Brunswick. It was land taken from Nova Scotia. St. John would become Canada's first incorporated city. Benedict Arnold, hero or traitor? Benedict Arnold, what do you think? Is he a hero or is he a traitor?
Traitor.
Well, it depends on what side of the St. Lawrence River you're on. If you're in New Brunswick, you might be considered a hero. If you're in Maine, and it wasn't New Brunswick, it was Nova Scotia. If you were in Maine, it wasn't Maine, it was Massachusetts at the time, he's probably a traitor. Anyway, that picture here, that is me, and that's Benedict Arnold, who has a totem pole in St. John, one of Canada's heroes, kind of, sort of. But in 1785, Benedict Arnold and his son Richard moved to St. John, New Brunswick. Well, you can get land there. And where they speculated in land and established a business doing trade with the West Indies. But all was not well with Benedict Arnold and the local people. Yeah, he purchased large tracts of land, acquired city lots in St. John and up a little bit in Fredericton. The family left St. John to return to London December 1791. Basically, they were thrown out of St. John and New Brunswick. Why? Bad land deals and a lot of lawsuits. Who won the War of 1812, Canada or the United States? Who won the War of 1812? What do you think? United States. United States. But if you're on the other side of the river, they'll tell you Canada. But it's a trick question. Canada didn't exist in 1812. It was the Americans and the Brits. Canada doesn't exist until 1867. It's June 1812 and the United States decides we're going to war against Great Britain because of three things. The British economic blockade of France, the impressment of thousands of neutral American seamen into the British Royal Navy against their will, and the British support of hostile Indian tribes along the Great Lakes frontier. Now, why was the Great Lakes so important? It's where the fur was, fox fur, and fox fur keeps you warm. So both countries wanted to control the fox fur trade. 36-year-old America declared war for the second time against Great Britain. The plan, conquer British North America, or Canada. It wasn't Canada then. Wrest North America for the United States once and for all, or at least the part that Britain had. It never happened. Never happened. Faction of U.S. Congress, made up of Western and Southern congressmen. Do you know where the West was? The West basically was Tennessee. The South, Tennessee and Georgia. That's basically the South. Florida was not part of the United States. Actually, the Alabama-Mississippi territory was part of it. The White House goes up in flames in 1814. That's because the Brits tried to burn down Washington. The Federalists, especially New Englanders who relied heavily on trade with Britain, accused war advocates or war hawks of using the excuse of maritime rights to promote their expansionist agenda. Most of the war was fought along the Great Lakes, like up in Mackinac Island. And again, this is one of these bad planning. The Americans have a stone wall around their fort in Mackinac Island, except they left part of it exposed. And the British just come right in and take over the fort on Mackinac Island. In the months following the U.S. declaration of war, the American forces launched a three-part invasion of British North America or Canada, and the British turned them back. At sea, it was a different story. Here's Britain. Britain is supposed to have the greatest navy in the world. You can't beat them. But, excuse me, the United States was successful, and the USS Constitution and other American frigates won a series of victories over British warships. In 1813, American forces won several key victories in the Great Lakes region, but Britain regained control of the sea and blockaded the eastern seaboard. Now this is Major General Robert Ross. Anybody here ever hear of him? Well, you know the White House was burnt down in 1814. Do you know who burnt down the White House? This guy, Major General Robert Ross of England. I'm going to test you on this after we're done. Anyway, and there's the White House, which wasn't called the White House in those days, it was the Executive House. It's 1814. Washington, D.C. fell to the British in August. In Washington, British troops burned down the White House, the Capitol, and other buildings in retaliation for earlier burning of government building in Ontario by U.S. soldiers in an area around what is now Toronto. So the Americans burnt down the buildings first, and these guys just retaliated. Well, Ross is moving, he's moving, he's moving, and he's going north. Not on the Washington-Baltimore Expressway, because it wasn't there in those days, but he gets to this place, Fort William McKendree, and that is my son, and he is in front of Fort William McKendree about 30 years ago. The British retreated. In Fort William McKendree, the Baltimore Harbor withstood a massive British bombardment and inspired a guy by the name of Francis Scott Key. You ever hear of that guy, Francis Scott Key? What did he write?
He wrote the Star
Spangled Banner. That's a poem. Wasn't set to music yet. On September 11th, 1814, the tide of the war changed when an American naval force under Thomas MacDonough won a decisive victory at the Battle of Plattsburgh in New York on Lake Champlain. A large British army under Sir George Prevost had to abandon the invasion of the Northeast, and the British returned to British North America or Canada, somewhere around the Montreal area. You thought I was going to talk about Canada? Told you, there's a lot of shared history here, a lot of which you never learned in school. That's Albert Gallatin. He is the U.S. envoy who ends the war between Britain and the United States. It's December 24th, 1814. It's Christmas Eve, and there's an agreement back to the 1812 borders. That's it. It's a waste of a war, an absolute waste of a war. Britain gives up American land near the border, the Great Lakes. The U.S. gives up Ontario, and they give land back to Florida, to Spain. They give the land back to Spain, even though the Americans want the land and would eventually get it. Florida. President Madison signs the agreement on February 17th, 1815, but nobody told this guy, Old Hickory, General Andrew Jackson. He's still out there, and he doesn't know that the war is over, but most people don't either. It takes months to get your message from England to the United States. News of the treaty took 2 months to cross the Atlantic, and British forces were not informed of the end of hostilities in time to end their drive against the mouth of the Mississippi down near New Orleans. On January 8th, 1815, a large British army attacked New Orleans and was decimated by an inferior American force under General Andrew Jackson. It was the most spectacular victory of the war, except it was a waste. the war was over. But don't despair at all. Somebody made out really well even though the war was over. You might remember this guy. His name was Johnny Horton. In 1959, he had the #1 song in America called The Battle of New Orleans. Anybody remember the Battle of New Orleans, the song? In 1814, we took a little trip. Took a little trip up the mighty Mississippi, right? Remember that song? #1 song. So who actually won the war? Well, this is Halifax. And they posed this question in front of the cemetery, why aren't we Americans? And they also do it in French. Well, there's really no answer, because nobody won the war, and it's kind of nebulous as to why we aren't Americans. We are not Americans because of the service of men like these sailors and soldiers, casualties of the War of 1812, buried in this historic burial ground. They fought and died at sea and the shore to prevent the United States invasion and annexation of our country. Well, they really didn't do that. They didn't go to Quebec. They didn't go to Nova Scotia. They didn't go to New Brunswick. They went into Ontario, but they went just right across Lake Ontario up to where Toronto is now. So they don't tell you exactly how they won the war, because they didn't win the war, nor did the Americans. Besides, there weren't even Canadians. But that's their explanation because of these guys, but they can't give you a full explanation. The War of 1812 was the last major confrontation between England and America. It ended in 1815. Most but not all territorial disputes were settled. Canadians, Native Americans, First Nations actually is what it's called in Canada, saw the war as a decisive turning point in their losing the struggle to govern themselves. Eventually, Canadians would go to Prince Edward Island and discuss their destiny, but all was not well. They made a very big mistake back in 1776, not going to the Americans' side, and they decided to stick with Canada. And that leads to this. There are two guys hanging around here. The rebellions of 1837 and 1838. And this, of course, is 61 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. The Revolutionary War started in 1775, and Nova Scotia decided we'll sit on the sidelines, as did Quebec. But the Quebecois did not like the Americans. They looked at the southern colonists, who would become the Americans, as godless and heathens, and they'd rather stay with the devil they knew, the Brits, than give it a go with these guys who they didn't really like. During the rebellions of 1837 and 1838 in Upper and Lower Canada, hundreds of armed citizens rose up against the government, protesting the injustices of the ruling elite, demanding changes in the politics and economics of imperial rule in British North America. Sound a lot like those guys in the late 1760s and 1770s, like Samuel Adams and a whole bunch of others. Patrick Henry. It just took them 7 decades to catch up. The revolt in Lower Canada, which is Quebec, was more serious and violent than the rebellion in Upper Canada. The Brits sent a guy by the name of Lord Durham to see what was going on the ground in British North America in 1839, and he makes a conclusion. What happened in 1837 and 1838? Basically, he said, well, you know what? We got to fix up the problems between the two Canadas, Upper and Lower Canada. His report on the affairs of British North America led to a series of reforms and changes. These included uniting the two Canadas into a single colony, the province of Canada, in 1841. Durham proposed the creation of municipal governments in the Supreme Court in British North America and the colonies. He also wanted to resolve the land question of Prince Edward Island. Where are they? Are they part of Nova Scotia? Are they going to be an independent country? Or might they become part of the United States? His long-held plan for the union of all B and A colonies was dropped because Nova Scotia and New Brunswick were uninterested. Back to Quebec City. That's Wolfe, that's Montcalm. the two main combatants in 1759 in terms of leading their countries in the battle in Quebec, and that's Parliament building. Durham believed that the problems in mostly French Lower Canada were ethnic in nature, not political. He found two nations warring in the bosom of a single state. Durham was culturally biased against French Canadians, and he came up with this phrase that Henry Ford would use in 1919. He called the Quebecois a people with no literature and no history. In 1919, Henry Ford, the automaker, bought the Dearborn Independent newspaper. And he was very anti-Semitic, and he wrote about the Jews, that the Jews were a people with no literature and no history, stealing that from Lord Durham. He recommended Lord Durham assimilating them by uniting the Canadas in a way that would allow the English-speaking majority in Upper Canada to dominate. Durham's report was condemned by Upper Canada's Tory elite. Reformers in Upper Canada and Nova Scotia hailed the idea of becoming an independent nation. Do you know about the Third War that almost happened between Britain and America in 1839? Nobody knows about this war that almost came to be?
No.
No. They got to rewrite history books. They really have to rewrite history books. That's St. John's, New Brunswick, and there's a reason there's a picture from New Brunswick. There was a northeast boundary dispute. The precise boundary line between Maine and New Brunswick remained a matter of often heated arguments for years after the close of the Revolutionary War. The dispute festered and smoldered until 1839, when it threatened to erupt into open warfare. The Maine legislature that year raised funds to support a military force of 10,000 to protect the state's border claims at Madawaska. Several hundred British regulars were dispatched to the scene from Quebec. At that point, the U.S. Congress entered the picture, approving $10 million for a military expenditure, which would be about $400 million today should a war break out. Roughly 50,000 troops were ready for action, and Major General Winfred Scott was dispatched to the scene. He managed to work out a temporary agreement between the two warring sides before the so-called War of Aroostook would break out. It never did, and Scott basically saved the day. There was also another slogan, 5440 or fight. Remember that one from school? 5440 or fight. Basically, the Americans wanted to extend the Oregon Territory up to where Alaska, Russian Alaska was. 1818, the United States and Great Britain established joint control of the Oregon Territory, the region west of the Rocky Mountains between 42 degrees north, the northern boundary of Spain, then Mexico's Alta California. In 5440 north, the southern boundary of Russia's Alaska Territory. By 1840, joint control had broken down, and the expansionist Democrats, including their 1844 presidential candidate James K. Polk, claimed the entire territory for the United States. The expansionist design was expressed by Polk's famous campaign slogan, 5440 or fight. The slogan also became a rallying cry of settlers into the territory. Popular phrase was picked up from Senator William Allen of Ohio, who coined the expression 1844 speech on the Senate floor. The dispute would be settled in 1846. The Americans got the Oregon Territory, at least half of it. Portland, keep Portland weird, that's Portland, Oregon. The Webster-Ashburn Treaty of 1842 partially delineated the northern United States, British North America, or Canada border with Maine, but left the border of the Oregon Territory unsettled. That was the Columbia River, and the Brits thought they were going to get everything north of the Columbia River. They didn't. The Oregon Territory existed from August 14, 1848 until February 14, 1859, when the southwest portion of the territory was admitted to the Union as the state of Oregon. The region was divided between the UK and the US in 1846. The area would include the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, parts of Wyoming, and also Montana. The British part would be British Columbia. Do you know that Windsor, Ontario is south of Detroit? A major Canadian city. Windsor is south of a major American city. It's true. In fact, most of Canada actually is south of the United States in some areas, the east part. Nova Scotia takes the lead. Nova Scotia became the first colony in British North America in the British Empire to achieve responsible government in January-February 1848 and became self-governing through the efforts of a guy by the name of Joseph Howe. Nova Scotia established representative government in 1858, which is 72 years after the Declaration of Independence, which today, July 2nd, was finished. They fled town because they didn't want to hang. That is Nova Scotia. That is the Nova Scotian port. And that is Halifax. That's the citadel in Halifax, which was not used during the War of 1812. All the British military operations went down to Bermuda because they were afraid the Americans would invade Nova Scotia. 1857, the province of Canada was in need of a permanent seat of government, a capital. For 15 years, the government had moved from one place to another: Kingston in 1841, Montreal 1844, Toronto 1849, Quebec City in 1855. Now, why Kingston was not suitable? Anybody been to the Thousand Islands? You've been to the Thousand Islands. So you know there's not much space between the United States and Canada around the Thousand Islands. Well, you go over the bridge and you hook a left and there's Kingston. Too close. Also the name. It's named after King George III. Couldn't do that. In the 1850s, somebody thought it was a good idea for Upper and Lower Canada to have a capital. Quebec City, Montreal, and Kingston, Ontario were in the running. And that is Montreal, reigning, but Montreal, too French. Quebec City, Quebec, way too French. Nobody speaks English there. On New Year's Eve, 1857, Queen Victoria, as a symbolic and political gesture, was presented with the responsibility of selecting a location for the permanent capital of the province of Canada. It is not, as of yet, a country. However, it was Prime Minister John A. Macdonald that assigned this selection to the process of the executive branch of the government, as previous attempts to arrive at a consensus had ended in a deadlock. Why Ottawa? Well, it's halfway between Quebec City and Toronto. The Queen's choice turned out to be a small frontier town of Ottawa for two reasons. Ottawa was isolated. It was in the backcountry and was surrounded by a dense forest, far from the American border. And this is important. It's 41 miles from the American border. But that forest was filled with malaria. And they felt that if they put a capital 40 miles away, and that would take a while with a horse, 40 miles away in a forest filled with malaria, they weren't going to attack Ottawa. And it was situated on a cliff, so they could see what was going on if there was an attack. And there is Ottawa. Ottawa was approximately midway between Toronto and Kingston in Canada's west, and Montreal and Quebec City in Canada's east. Nova Scotia was pretty much on its own, but the others were controlled by Great Britain. Ottawa would become the capital. One other thing about Ottawa, it used to be called Bytown. It was filled with prostitutes and swindlers. They wanted to clean up the town so the politicians could come in. Is that kind of an oxymoron here? You want to clean out the town for politicians to come in? Well, they did. Ever hear of the Pig War? Never heard of the Pig War? It's not in your history book, so you don't know about it. These are the San Juan Islands. And they were kind of a disputed place even after the 49th parallel was set as the border. The Pig War starts in 1859. The wording of the Oregon Treaty was vague when it came to the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver Island, where Victoria is, because there were several navigable waterways between Vancouver Island and the mainland. The ownership of the San Juan Islands remained contested. In 1859, a pig wandered from the British-Canadian side to the American side and was shot in an American settler's garden. This starts the pig war. Why would they start a war? But they did. The pig was shot, the British demanded compensation, and the American troops were sent to occupy the island while the British warships patrolled offshore. It took 13 years to come up with a solution what to do with the pig. 13 years. They finally did. 1864, this is Confederate Hall, and it's in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. In September of that year, Prince Edward Island hosted the Charlottetown Conference, which was the first meeting in the process leading to the Quebec resolutions and the creation of Canada in 1867. There's an Alaska problem. Sitka. Sitka was the last capital of, in fact, I was there on July 4th, 2017. That's where I spent the 4th of July, after spending July 1st in Vancouver on July 1st, the 150th anniversary of the Canadian independence. Anyway, so here I am. I'm in Sitka. This is the last capital of Russia, Alaska. Alaska Purchase forced the British colonists to form a country. Canada was formed 3 months after the Alaska Purchase. Russia sold Alaska to the United States, so Great Britain wouldn't get it. It needed $7.2 million, and that would probably be today about $280 million, 2 cents an acre. The northern colonists began seeking their own country in 1839. Soon after the American Civil War, the pro-Canadian Confederation premiered. Charles Tupper led Nova Scotia into the Canadian Confederation July 1st, 1867, along with New Brunswick and the province of Canada. Prince Edward Island didn't go. They didn't like the terms. They were looking, well, maybe we'll join the United States, maybe we'll be our own country, or maybe we'll stay with Britain. How many of you been here in Niagara Falls? Slowly I turn, step by step, inch by inch. Abbott and Costello, Niagara Falls. The fun side is the Ontario side, and we are looking here from the fun side, Niagara Falls, Ontario. What were the reasons to leave? Political deadlock, leaving England. Political deadlock resulting from the current political structure. Demographic pressure. Let's go westward. Go west, young man. I don't know if they had their own Horace Greeley. Economic nationalism and the promise of economic development. An inter-colony railroad which would improve trade, military movement, and transportation in general. Cancellation of the Canadian-American Reciprocity Treaty, a free trade policy whereby products were allowed into the United States without taxes or tariffs starting in 1854, which was then considered to be a benefit for Canada. In 1865, the United States, partly as revenge against Great Britain for support of the South in the American Civil War. That's John Hamilton Gray, and that's John Hamilton Gray. And I'm between John Hamilton Gray and John Hamilton Gray on the street in Charlottetown, PEI, because I'm not sure which one's John Hamilton Gray and who the other John Hamilton Gray is. But there are 2 John Hamilton Grays. The possible threat of an invasion from the U.S. increased by the Alaska Purchase of 1867, which was supported on the floor of the U.S. Senate by Charles Sumner, among others. He was the guy who was beaten up, really beaten up badly back in the 1850s during the lead-up to the American Civil War. Precisely in terms of taking over the remainder of North America from Britain. Seward's Folly. William Henry Seward. By the way, anybody go to Seward High School here? Lower East Side, Manhattan? My mother did. Do you know who the most famous alum of Seward High School is? Lower Manhattan? Ever hear of Bernie Schwartz?
Tony Curtis.
Tony Curtis.
Tony Curtis.
Yeah, Tony Curtis is the most
From
famous
Bernie
alum.
Ford to Tony Curtis.
Yeah, most famous alum of Seward High School.
Oh.
Anyway, he's the guy who ended up negotiating the deal with the Russians. The English Raids, which were an Irish Republican, or rather the Fenian Raids, which was an Irish Republican organization based in the United States on British Army forts, custom posts, and other targets in Canada, 1866. The Little Englander philosophy, whereby Britain no longer wanted to maintain troops in the colonies, save money. Political pressure from British financiers who invested money in the money-losing Grand Trunk Railroad. This is Vancouver, and they're finally a country. America surrounded the British colonial territory. The northwest border now is Alaska. South of the 49th parallel was U.S. territories. Canada starts in the east. In 1867, there were three options open: continuous British colonies, to be annexed by the United States, or become a country. In Britain, some hoped that its North American colonies, which were draining them, would depart from the British Empire. Ships and demands. Now, how did the Civil War play into what was going on in British Columbia? It's a question you've never pondered because it's a question that's never in any textbooks. The Alabama claims, were a series of demands for damages sought by the U.S. government of the United States from the United Kingdom in 1869 for attacks upon Union merchant ships by the Confederate Navy commerce raiders built in the British shipyards during the American Civil War. So the Americans said, hey, you built these ships. If you didn't build these ships, we would never have these attacks. Well, it would come down to this, British Columbia, and that's right outside of Vancouver. It's a nice picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
Vancouver is the nicest city in North America in terms of scenery. It's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. You got Stanley Park there, Queen Elizabeth Park, a whole bunch of other things, and mountains and mountains and mountains. This is just outside of Vancouver. When the American Secretary of State, William H. Seward, negotiated the Alaska Purchase with Russia in 1867, that was supposed to be the first step in a comprehensive plan to gain control of the entire Pacific Northwest, from Alaska down to California. Seward expected British Columbia to seek annexation to the U.S. and thought Britain might accept this in exchange for the American claims, the Alabama claims. But they didn't, and that is British Columbia, that is Victoria, British Columbia. London continued to stall. American commercial and financial groups pressured Washington for a quick settlement of the dispute on a cash basis. But there was a growing Canadian nationalism sentiment in British Columbia calling for staying inside the British Empire. Congress became preoccupied with Reconstruction, and most Americans really didn't care about getting British Columbia. There was a problem that the British Columbians had with the people in the Washington Territory. They were drunk, and they would come across the border. They didn't like that they were causing mayhem. So much so that the British Columbians thought maybe they should build a wall to keep the Americans out of British North America. But eventually there would be an alliance, and again, this is Canada 150, 7 years ago. 1869, Seward visited Victoria, proposing an economic alliance between Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California. And it all depended on this, the railroad. If British Columbia could get a railroad from Canada, going from Halifax right across the country to Vancouver, they were going to take the Canadian offer. A province, not a state. The delegation sent to Ottawa in 1870 to present British Columbia's demands to Canada. The demands included a call for responsible provincial government, economic aid, debt concessions, the cost of building a major transportation link to train. With the train would come BC as a province instead of an American state. Canada is a large country. It's a very large country. Goes from here to there, surrounded by the United States to here, and the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by the United States to here, and then the Atlantic Ocean and Hudson's Bay. So it basically, it's the guy who lives on the top floor of the building, if it's a two-story building, or if it's bigger, the Americans got the bottom half, the Canadians have the top half. Canada has 11 provinces, 2 territories, and it goes into the Arctic Ocean, 9.98 million square kilometers, or 3.8 million square miles. It is the second largest country in the world by area. Canada's southern border with the United States and northern border too. It's about 8,891 kilometers, or 5,525 miles. It is the longest border in the world, the longest border in the world. And we're looking at Quebec here. This is Chicoutimi, Quebec, and it's an October day. It's gorgeous up in Chicoutimi. These are the territories, provinces: Alberta, British Columbia, Manitoba, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Northwest Territories, Nova Scotia. I have not been in Manitoba. I haven't been in the Northwest Territories. I've been all the other places here. Nunavut, which became a territory, I've never been up there, and I have no reason ever to go up there. Ontario, Prince Edward Island, Quebec, Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan's like Kansas. They grow wheat there. That's the wheat basket of Canada. And the Yukon, which I've been to. Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, and Nunavut are provinces. Northwest Territories and Yukon are not. And this basically is the Maritimes. It used to be Acadia, now it's the Maritimes. And they depend on for their livelihoods on the sea. Do you know that the Vikings were there in the year 1000 or so? Do you know that the Vikings were there? They were there long before Columbus. They were there. They quote-unquote discovered North America, although the area was populated. That is St. Anthony, where the Vikings set up camp for a little while on St. Anthony's, Newfoundland. More than likely, the Vikings were looking for wood and ended up near St. Anthony's about the year 1000. And there are some ruins there that suggest that. John Cabot, a Venetian sailing for Britain, claimed the land for Britain in 1497. The only confirmed Viking site on the American continent is L'Anse-aux-Meadows, a 1,000-year-old way station discovered in 1960 on the northern tip of Newfoundland. There's some thought that the Vikings got as far south as Massachusetts or Maine in those days. The Newfies, anybody ever been up to Newfoundland? Well, there are 2 dogs that you might know, the Newfies and the Labs. Well, where do they come from? Here, Newfoundland. And that's a colorful downtown St. John. 1854, the British government established Newfoundland's first responsible government. The Dominion of Newfoundland was a country in eastern North America, established September 26, 1907. Do you know that there was another country in North America? They had some problems, particularly when the stock market crashed. They went broke. British Parliament passed the Newfoundland Act 1933 after the country went broke. 1934, Newfoundland became the only dominion to give up its self-government status, which ended 79 years of self-government. On July 24, 1948, the Newfies went to the polls to decide if they wanted a confederation or dominion status. By a vote of 52-48, they decided to join the Confederation, and they joined Canada on March 31st, 1949. This is where radio started. Marconi was on top of this mountain, old deserted hospital, and he gets a signal from Cornwall in England. The first transatlantic wireless transmission from Cornwall, UK to St. John's, Newfoundland took place December 12th, 1901. Marconi placed his receiver at Signal Hill, St. John's, nearly the closest point to Europe in North America at a distance of about 2,100 miles. Marconi picked up the signal. This is Prince Edward Island, and this is where, in this building, where Canada started.
Wait a minute.
Prince Edward Island consists of the island of the same name as well as smaller islands nearby. It's one of the 4 maritime provinces, and it's the smallest province in both land and population, but they grow 25% of the potatoes consumed by Canadians. Prince Edward Island did not find joining the Union to its liking in 1867, chose to remain a British territory. But they decided to talk to President Ulysses S. Grant and the Grant administration in 1868. They were discussing trade options, but they were still Brits. And the Brits weren't too happy with the Americans, even though they did have a treaty in the West. And they told the officials at PEI, you ain't going to America. Don't count on it. But the Americans had an open invitation to go. And they thought about it again in 1871, but the country of Canada said, we'll take care of all your needs. They joined the Confederation in 1873. And again, they grew 25% of Canada's potatoes. That's the Yukon. That is the Yukon. And no, I did not see Nelson Eddy or Jeanette MacDonald up there. The Klondike Gold Rush, often called the Yukon Gold Rush, was a mass exodus of prospecting migrants from their hometowns to Canada's Yukon Territory and Alaska after gold was discovered there in 1896. Now, again, here's the American influence. The last 2 places you could get equipment were Winnipeg, I'll talk about Winnipeg in a minute, and Seattle. From Seattle, you could go right up to the Yukon by boat. Seattle becomes a major hub and becomes a city because of the Klondike Gold Rush in Canada. Seattle owes a lot to Canada. For Seattle, the gold rush created a boom that attracted people from all over the world, even after the gold rush ended. The idea of striking it rich led over 100,000 people from all walks of life to abandon their homes and embark on an extended, life-threatening journey across treacherous, icy valleys and harrowing, rocky terrain. And that is Carcross, or the sign to Carcross, and Whitehorse. Whitehorse is in, yes?
A little bit of trivia
Yeah.
on the Yukon.
Yeah.
Donald Trump's grandfather.
Yes, his
made
grandfather had,
money.
yes, he had brothels there.
He owned a,
He owned a brothel.
right,
He owned a brothel. And I think I have the picture of the brothel that he owned in Victoria. Okay. Dawson City turned into an American-style frontier town with dance halls, theaters, and saloons. The men outnumbered the women 25-1. Prostitution was tolerated. By the summer of 1899, there were rumors about another gold rush in Nome, Alaska. Within a week, half of Dawson emptied. The Klondike Gold Rush ran its course. The influx of people to Dawson turned Dawson into a legitimate city. It also led to a population boom in the Yukon Territory, where it's always cold and dark in the winter, Alberta, British Columbia, and Vancouver. The Klondike Gold Rush is credited for helping the United States out of the 1893 pandemic or depression. Told you there is a shared history between these 2 countries that you don't even realize because you weren't taught it in school. That is Newfoundland, and that's St. John's. The quick maritime facts: New Brunswick, PEI, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Labrador, they're less wealthy than the rest of Canada. Fishing is a major livelihood, but oil has been discovered off Nova Scotia, and Halifax is a fast-growing city. It's a college town. Newfoundland and Labrador became one in 1927, and that is St. John's, New Brunswick. There, and where Benedict Arnold's a hero. First settlement in 1604, France claimed Acadia. 1713, Great Britain gets it. The Acadians are exiled in 1755. New Brunswick founded in 1784. The partition of Nova Scotia into 2 areas. St. John's, New Brunswick becomes the first incorporated city in 1885, thanks to the Loyalists fleeing the U.S. This is Louis B. Mayer Synagogue. Remember Louis B. Mayer from MGM? Yeah, that's his synagogue. when the immigration from Europe came about, there were places you went to: Halifax, St. John, New Brunswick, Boston, New York, and Galveston. And St. John was one of the places that the immigrants from Europe ended up. Louis B. Mayer went to the synagogue, left money for it, and I actually give to that synagogue every year, but that is his synagogue. St. John's, New Brunswick, the city hall there. Halifax and St. John's, New Brunswick, first places of entry in Canada for immigrants. Canada did not place quotas on immigration until 1933, 9 years after the U.S. imposed immigration quotas. So if you were from East Europe, if you were Italian, and if you were Jewish, you were still able to get into Canada, even though there was a quota against you getting into the country in the United States with the Johnson-Reed Act. St. John's, New Brunswick, they have a reverse falls that you'd think that the river's going backwards. Halifax, Halifax, that's a train station. And if you want to get from Halifax to Vancouver, catch the train right there. When I was there that day, they were shooting a movie. Quebec City, Quebec City is the only stone, it is the only city that is protected by a stone fortress. There is Ottawa, Parliament Hill up in Ottawa. There's Montreal. And behind me is the city of Montreal. First Nations. First Nations. Those are Native Americans called First Nations. On July 25th, 2022, Pope Francis apologized to Canadians, Native people on their land for the church's role in schools where indigenous children were abused, calling their forced cultural assimilation a deplorable, evil, and disastrous error. Same thing. They put Native Americans, First Nations, onto reservations. Pope Francis was sorry for Christian support of the colonizing mentality of the times and called for a serious investigation of the schools to help survivors and descendants heal. TO, Toronto, that's New York, the New York of Canada. That is where all of the communications are. They have their own street, the Wall Street equivalent up in Toronto, Bloor Street, Toronto. That's the Soo. The Soo is really important, Sault Ste. Marie, in the relationship between the U.S. and Canada. The Soo was part of New France. The area was ceded to Britain in 1763, and in 1783, the Northwest Company founded a trading post there, built a small lock canal, completed in 1797 and 98, to handle canoes and small boats for trading purposes. The lock was destroyed by U.S. troops, War of 1812. Now you know why they wanted to burn down the White House, and rebuilt as a historic site in the late 19th century. It is an important port. Not only that, you got the bridge that connects the United States to Canada, where a lot of goods go over. The Soo Locks is the busiest lock system in the world by cargo tonnage. On average, between 7,000 and 10,000 ships come through the locks during the shipping season, which is short, each year. Built in 1855, these locks connect Lake Superior to Lake Huron. And that is where the lakes converge over there, and there is the bridge. The Sault Ste. Marie International Bridge spans the St. Mary's River between the United States and Canada, connecting the twin cities of Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. It is the 10th busiest passenger crossing in the Canadian-U.S. border, and the only land crossing for 700 miles. Welcome to Alberta, and this is the border between Montana and Alberta. Just a fence with some barbed wire. And the barbed wire is there to keep the cattle from one side of Alberta to go into the side of Montana. That's basically it. Hey, remember King Kong?
King Kong.
King Kong, the movie with Fay Wray?
Yeah.
Remember that movie? Fay Wray, King Kong, Cardston, Alberta. And this is the Fay Wray Fountain. There is King Kong, and there's Fay Wray. There's the King Kong Fay Wray connection there, and there's me standing under King Kong. That is a Vancouver sunrise. Think it's pretty? Vancouver sunrise. That is Victoria, BC. That was in 2017. Anybody been to Victoria? You have. Did you get afternoon tea at the Empress Hotel? Oh, you're not fancy enough. Not fancy enough. They serve tea every day at 4 o'clock at the Empress Hotel. I played hockey in a pickup game with Gordie Howe once, a charity game. And of course, hockey is the sport in Canada, although lacrosse is the official sport of Canada. And wherever you go, you find the Tim Hortons donut shop. I've been to hundreds of Tim Hortons donut shops. And the birthplace of Canada is Prince Edward Island. Canada got into World War I in 1914 when England got involved. Canada entered World War II in 1936, also when England got involved. In 1931, Canada achieved near total independence from the United Kingdom through the Statute of Westminster, 1931, but they didn't gain full sovereignty because they didn't know how to do it. Australia did it, New Zealand did it, but they couldn't figure out, how do we break the remaining ties? It took them 51 years to figure it out. But they finally got it with the Canadian Act of 1982, and officially King Charles III is the guy who's the head of Canada, but it's ceremonial at best. And he's got to worry about his kids. What are his kids, Harry and William? Are those his kids? I don't even know what his kids' names are. Canada is a federal parliamentary democracy in a constitutional monarchy with King Charles being the head of state. The country is officially bilingual at the federal level, but only bilingual in New Brunswick. The official language in Quebec is French, in New Brunswick it's French and English. And Queen Elizabeth was really well liked in Canada. There are tons of statues with Queen Elizabeth. King Charles is the ceremonial head of state and appoints his representative to each province. And there is Queen Elizabeth and Prince Edward Island. July 1st is a national holiday, but in Quebec, Saint Jean-Baptiste Day is a bigger holiday. It takes place on June 24th. René Lévesque was the guy who tried to push Quebec into sovereignty and an independent nation. Separatist movement was dropped by the party for most of the 1980s, especially after the partition of the Canadian Constitution without the consent of the Parti Québécois government and the creation of the federal charters and freedoms which enshrine the protection of French language and French-Canadian culture in Canada. The first referendum to break away occurred in 1980 when asked if the Québécois wished to or open to constitutional negotiations with the federal government and other provinces for the intended purpose of establishing a sovereign association pact between the province of Quebec and the rest of Canada. 60% of the voting public said no, put forth by the Parti Québécois. That is the fleur de lis, that is the flag. 1995, after two failed attempts by the Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, who I interviewed once, recently passed away, Mulroney's government secured the Québécois ratification of amendments to the Constitution. The Parti Québécois held the second referendum. The question was whether one wished for the independence of the province of Quebec from the rest of Canada. It was far closer, but it failed, 50.38 to 49.62. There are the massive stone walls that protect Quebec City. That's the cliff the British had to climb up to get to here, Plains of Abraham. They climbed up that cliff, and that was the end of domination by France in Quebec City. Ever hear of this guy, Alexander Graham Bell?
Yeah.
Ahoy, ahoy, that's how he wanted you to answer the phone. While living in Nova Scotia, Bell started working on the harmonic telegraph, a device that allowed multiple messages to be transmitted over a wire at the same time. While trying to perfect this technology, which was backed by a group of investors, Bell became preoccupied with finding a way to transmit human voice over wires. Bell System, public telephone. You don't see those signs anymore. Bell was born in Scotland, raised in Cape Breton, and would work on this invention at his homes in Nova Scotia and the United States. March 7th, 1876. Bell was granted U.S. patent 1744, 65A for method of transmitting speech by telegraphy. In Boston, the first telephone call was made, and he didn't say ahoy ahoy on March 10th, 1876. His first words were, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." That is the historic site in Nova Scotia. He died at his private estate, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, at the age of 75, August 2nd, 1922. And did he have a telephone in his office, yes or no?
No.
No. Didn't want to be bothered by phone calls.
Oh.
He invented the phone. Titanic, that tragedy off of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. The Maritime Museum up in Halifax of the Atlantic has an exhibit dedicated to the sinking of the Titanic, where there's a deck chair from the ship and also oak molding from the forward class staircase. It's my old Grundig radio. That radio was made in 1951. I never listened to it anymore. Can't get the tubes or replace the tubes if one burns out. It used to be good. AM, FM, shortwave. Could listen to Radio Bulgaria if I wanted to. 1912, David Sarnoff managed the Marconi wireless station at the Wanamaker's department store in New York City. Anybody go to Wanamaker's back in the day? Long gone.
Long time
Oh, long gone.
ago.
On the evening of April 14th, 1912, Titanic hit an iceberg and the rest is history. The wireless operator at Wanamaker's was this guy, David Sarnoff. Almost immediately, the ship began transmitting distress signals. Soon the airwaves were flooded with the rest of the news or the news of the disaster. Operators tracked the rescue effort. After 3 days of being in Manhattan, he goes out to Coney Island, but he's not going out for a swim, not this time of year. He's going out to the Marconi Seagate Station on Coney Island. And he's talking to the steamship, the Carpathia, which picked up the passengers that survived the sinking, and he told the families, hey, they're coming home. Near Sondorf. And he figured out, you know what, if I could get voice attached to this, it could be a great, great thing. U.S. Congress, which had previously hesitated to regulate the airwaves, seized upon the disaster to pass the Radio Act in 1912. The law divided the electromagnetic spectrum between amateur government and commercial users, like me. I was supposed to get a third-class license, but I'm going to tell you something. Don't share it with anybody. Don't share it. I never got a third-class license. So when I started out, I was on radio illegally. But you don't have to tell anybody. Even guys like Sarnoff had to have a license. To accommodate the demand for trained wireless experts, the Marconi company recruited Sarnoff to act as an instructor at the newly organized Technical Institute. Eventually, Sarnoff hooked up with the Radio Corporation of America. You remember RCA?
Yes.
The RCA building? Sarnoff was not the only radio operator, but was the most famous, and this was his product. NBC Radio, NBC Red, NBC Blue. The sinking of the Titanic brought radio into the public spotlight and prompted the U.S. Congress to regulate the medium for the first time. Sarnoff would refer to this incident as an important turning point in his career. The Titanic disaster brought radio to the front, and incidentally, anybody hear of the harbor explosion in 1917? Biggest man-made explosion ever until 1945. It's wartime. The harbor is foggy. It's December 6, 1917, and the French munition ship, the Mont Blanc, collides with a steamer. 2,000 casualties. Part of the city level. Boston sent aid and to this day receives an annual Christmas tree from Halifax as a thanks for helping out in the Halifax disaster. That's the explosion. 1,600 people were killed instantly. 9,000 injured, 300 of whom would die a little later. Every building in a 1.6-mile radius was either badly damaged or destroyed. That's the memorial. I was there 2 months before the 100th anniversary, and they were fixing up the place at that time. Hundreds of people who had been watching the fire from their homes were blinded when the blast shattered the windows in front of them. And here's the neighborhood. Things have been reinforced in the neighborhood if it ever happened again. An extensive comparison of 130 major explosions by the Halifax historian Jay White, 1994, concluded that the Halifax harbor remains unchallenged in overall magnitude as long as 5 criteria were considered together: number of casualties, force of the blast, radius of devastation, quantity of explosive material, and total value of property destroyed. For many years afterwards, the Halifax explosion was the standard by which all large blasts were measured. Time magazine report on the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, 1945, wrote the explosive power of the little boy bomb was 7 times that of the Halifax explosion. Real close relations. You can take a ferry from Portland to Halifax or back. Oh, remember the Iranian hostage crisis of 1980? Remember that? I was there, Stewart Air Force Base, when they came home. I was supposed to talk to them, but we couldn't. Anyway, the Canadians had a big role in that hostage negotiation of 1980. On January 29, 1980, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency and the Canadian government conducted a successful undercover operation to evacuate 6 of the American hostages who were found refuge with Canadian diplomats in Tehran during the early months of the protracted hostage situation. Canada has astronauts, and one of them is going to the moon sometime in the future. That is the Canadarm, the space bud. The Canadian Space Agency is the National Space Agency of Canada, established in 1990 by the Canadian Space Agency Act. Canada's Space Agency is to promote the peaceful use and development of space, to advance the knowledge of space through science, and ensure that space science and technology provide social and economic benefits for Canadians. It works closely with NASA. So closely that one of the astronauts scheduled to go to the moon is a Canadian. On April the 3rd, 2023, NASA and the Canadian Space Agency announced that 4 astronauts will venture around the moon on Artemis II, the first crewed mission on NASA's path to establishing a long-time presence at the moon for science and exploration. The astronauts include Christina Hammond-Koch, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen. The first flight was supposed to take place this year. It's been pushed back. We're leaving Canada. We're leaving. Canada is the United States' biggest trade partner. There have been squabbles over lumber and fish. The Ogdensburg Agreement was a defense agreement negotiated between Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King and Franklin Roosevelt near Ogdensburg, New York, August 17, 1940. It outlined a permanent plan for mutual defense overseas between the United States and Canada and established the Permanent Joint Board of Defense. In September 1957, the 2 nations agreed to create the North American Air Defense Command, or NORAD, headquartered in Colorado Springs, Colorado, as a binational command, centralizing operational control of continent air defenses against the threat of Soviet bombers. And who tracks Santa Claus on Christmas Eve? NORAD.
Postal Service.
NORAD. NORAD now. They tell you where Santa Claus is. On May 12, 1958, the agreement between the Canadians and the Americans established NORAD was finalized. The agreement included 11 principles governing the organization and the operation of NORAD and called for a renewal of the agreement every 10 years. Well, this is Boston. This is 1976. July 4th, and there is a special guest in Boston at the 200th anniversary of the reading of the Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, was passed today back in 1776. They all fled town because they did not want to be swinging the end of a noose. The Queen Elizabeth II spent July 4th, 1976 in Boston celebrating the Declaration of Independence 200th anniversary. President Gerald Ford and Queen Elizabeth II toasted one another in Washington a few days later. Is it Fred and Ginger, or is it Gerald and the Queen? Shall we dance? It's okay to be a Canuck, even though they never answered that question as to why are we Canadians. Any questions? Any comments? That is your lesson in Canada today.
Okay,
Did you know how close the United States and Canada really are,
yes, they are.
besides borders?